Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking a shortcut through a really critical and frankly quite sobering section of psychiatric literature.
Yes, it covers the immense challenges faced by children caught up in various systemic
We're
crises.
talking high-risk youth, those in foster care, kids dealing with chronic illness, facing systemic bias.
Mm.
It's a lot.
Exactly. And our aim here is really to pull out the key ideas, the diagnostic frameworks, the main interventions, and even some surprising neuroscience behind these vulnerabilities.
The scale we're discussing is just enormous. I mean, look at foster care alone.
Hmm.
Studies suggest anywhere from, 50% up to 90% of children in the system need mental health intervention,
It's staggering.
compared to maybe 10%, 20% in the general population. That tells you right away system involvement itself is a massive risk factor.
And those risks, they often start even before a child enters care. The sources we looked at mention about 80% of kids coming into the system had in utero exposure to drugs or alcohol.
80%.
Yeah. And a full one-third, already have a chronic medical issue. So these are incredibly vulnerable kids from the get-go.
So let's start there with the foster care system. You mentioned the reasons kids are separated have changed.
Profoundly. It really reflects bigger societal shifts. 50 years ago, it was often more about parental tragedy, illness, death, maybe severe financial problems today. It's overwhelmingly driven by parental substance use disorders and, frankly, the impact of poverty, which often manifests as neglect.
So it's shifted from sort of unavoidable tragedy to more of a public health crisis
Yeah,
and maybe systemic failures.
exactly. That's a good way to put it. The system tries to adapt, moving towards kinship care, placing kids with relatives.
Right, that makes sense.
And trying to stop kids cycling in and out. But there's this persistent problem with adolescents leaving the system.
The aging out issue.
Yes, over 20,000 young people age out every year, often with very little support. There's been federal legislation, like the Fostering Connections Act back in 2008, mandating transition plans for housing, education, and crucially, thanks to the Affordable Care Act, Medicaid eligibility is extended until age 26.
Okay, so there's recognition of a need for a bridge.
There is. The system acknowledges a responsibility, but while putting it into practice consistently is still a huge challenge.
And what's really striking, even for kids in the system, flagged as high risk, the sources point out these major disparities in who actually gets help.
They absolutely do. It's quite stark. Minority children, especially Black children, are consistently less likely to receive mental health services compared to white children.
Even with similar issues.
Even when their objective behavioral scores are just as high or sometimes higher, it really suggests this powerful, sort of invisible cultural bias in how need is seen and addressed by everyone involved.
Caseworkers, courts,
Eh.
the whole system.
Yes. And when intervention is given, there's this heavy reliance on medication. Psychotropic meds are often used way more in foster care, maybe 2 to 8 times the rate of peers not in care.
Wow, why is that?
Well, the analysis suggests we might be substituting medication for the harder, more expensive psychosocial interventions, things like intensive family therapy or better long-term support, stable housing.
So treating a systemic problem like it's just an individual chemical imbalance.
That's the chilling insight, yes. It's easier, maybe cheaper in the short term, to prescribe a pill than to fix the system or provide intensive therapy.
Okay, let's shift from the system itself to the trauma children experience child maltreatment. The numbers are still high.
Depressingly so. The 2018 data on substantiated cases showed 61% were neglect, 11% physical abuse, and 7% sexual abuse. And those are just the substantiated cases, remember.
Right, the ones proven. And for psychiatrists, the role here is complex, isn't it?
It's twofold, really. There's the treatment side, helping kids deal with the emotional fallout, but there's also the forensic side, evaluations about credibility, competency to testify in court.
And when the abuse is chronic, severe, like repeated trauma, the sources say the impact goes beyond standard PTSD.
Yes, the text brings up complex PTSD, or an older term you might hear, disorder of extreme stress. Not otherwise specified, desnos.
Desnos. Okay, what defines that?
It's not just about flashbacks or nightmares, though those can be there.
Yeah.
The defining feature is this profound breakdown in the ability to regulate your internal state,
Regulate internal state.
like emotions.
Emotions, yes, but also attention, how you see yourself, your relationships with others. It's a core disruption in managing your own inner world.
And does the brain science back this up? Neuroimaging.
It does. People with PTSD, especially from chronic trauma, often show specific brain changes,
Mm.
things like reduced volume in the hippocampus.
Which affects memory.
Memory and context, yes.
Mhm.
And then hyperreactivity in the amygdala, the brain's sort of alarm center. Their brains are essentially stuck in this high alert mode
Constantly scanning for threats.
constantly, which makes it incredibly hard to manage everyday stress and emotions.
Okay, let's pivot slightly. How does vulnerability show up in, say, a medical setting? Chronic physical illness or even just hospitalization? Well, young children, especially those under sun, are particularly vulnerable. Hospitalization can cause lasting emotional or behavioral problems for them.
Why them specifically?
It disrupts their early attachment, their sense of safety and trust. Their understanding is also different. A school-age kid, for example, might think their illness is somehow a punishment because their thinking is still quite concrete, quite black and white.
That leads us to something called vulnerable child syndrome, VCS. What does that involve?
VCS is really interesting. It's less about how sick the child actually was and more about the parent's lingering anxiety after the illness, almost like a kind of parental medical PTSD.
So it's the parent's reaction driving it.
Primarily, you see things like pathologic separation anxiety. The parent can't let the child out of their sight. They might infantilize the child, being overly protective, overly indulgent, and there's often this intense focus on the child's body, constant worry.
And you said it's linked more to the mother's anxiety.
Yes, the research indicates it's better predicted by the mother's anxiety level when the child is discharged from the hospital than by how severe the child's actual medical problem was initially.
Wow. So the child basically absorbs the parent's fear, becoming dependent instead of resilient.
Precisely. And this connects to PTSD after medical events, too. Often, the child's PTSD symptoms correlate more strongly with how distressed the parent is, rather than the objective severity of the medical procedure or illness itself.
Children really do take their cues from their parents.
Especially mothers, yes. The family system becomes the main driver of how everyone copes.
Okay, moving into adolescence now. Big challenges here with substance use and increasingly technology. What's the critical point about treating substance use disorders or SUDs in teens?
The absolute biggest challenge is comorbidity. The vast majority, really, of adolescents referred for substance treatment also have another psychiatric disorder.
Like depression, anxiety.
Depression, anxiety, ADHD, conduct disorder, you name it. But, and this is the key problem, treatment systems often tackle these issues separately. The substance use gets treated here, the depression over there.
So they're not integrating the care.
Often not concurrently, no. Which is a huge missed opportunity because the issues are almost always intertwined. You can't effectively treat one without addressing the other.
Are there specific medications mentioned that can help adolescents?
The sources cite a couple. For cannabis use disorder, which is very common, N-acetylcysteine, often called NAC, has shown some promise in reducing cravings.
Right.
And for opioid use disorder, buprenorphine is approved for use in youth aged 16 and older. But the text emphasizes that for OUD, long-term maintenance treatment is usually needed to really change the course of the disorder. It's not a quick fix.
Right. Let's talk sleep. Also crucial for regulation. Sleep problems in kids aren't just about being tired, are they?
Definitely not. From a behavioral standpoint, we often see two main types of insomnia in childhood. There's the limit-setting type.
That sounds like battles over bedtime.
Exactly. The parent has difficulty establishing and enforcing a consistent bedtime routine. Then there's the sleep onset association type,
Meaning?
meaning the child relies on something external and, frankly, maladaptive to fall asleep, like needing to be fed or rocked or watching TV. They haven't learned to self-soothe into sleep.
Okay, and what about physical sleep issues like sleep apnea? The presentation in kids can be tricky.
Very tricky and crucial for clinicians to know. Obstructive sleep apnea syndrome, OSAS. In adults, the classic sign is excessive daytime sleepiness.
Right, falling asleep at work or whatever.
Yes, but children with OSAS, they rarely show that. Instead, they often present with externalizing behaviors.
Of acting out.
Hyperactivity, aggression, difficulty paying attention. It can look almost exactly like ADHD.
Wow. So a kid might get an ADHD diagnosis when the real problem is they aren't breathing properly at night.
It's a critical differential diagnosis to consider. You absolutely have to ask about sleep, snoring, restless sleep if you see those ADHD-like symptoms.
Good point. Okay, switching to digital life. Internet gaming disorder, IGD. Another impulse control issue.
Yes, and like SUDs, it often co-occurs with other things, especially anxiety and depression.
There was a case example in the text.
Yeah, a compelling one. A 17-year-old math student. He got treatment for depression and his mood improved, but he was still failing academically. Why? Because he couldn't control his gaming.
How so?
He'd plan, say, a 15-minute break to play a game, but then he'd get sucked in for hours trying to achieve something in the game, level up, whatever. That loss of control, that inability to regulate the impulse, kept derailing his real-world responsibilities.
Even when his depression was better.
Exactly. The underlying regulation problem persisted.
Okay, last major section. Navigating the systems kids encounter. Education, ethics, equity. Let's start with schools. What's the difference between an IEP and a 504 plan? People hear those terms a lot.
They do. Both are legal frameworks for supporting students with disabilities, but they function differently. An IEP, Individualized Education Program, is for providing special education services. A student has to qualify under specific categories, like emotional disturbance or a specific learning disability.
So it involves specialized instruction, maybe different classrooms?
It can, yes. A 504 plan, on the other hand, provides accommodations within the general education setting.
Like what?
Things like preferential seating, extra time on tests, frequent checks for understanding. It helps level the playing field for students with disabilities who don't necessarily need specialized instruction.
And there's a key difference for after high school.
Yes, this is important for you to know. The 504 plan is what can carry over to provide accommodations in college and other post-secondary settings. The IEP typically ends with high school.
Got it. Okay, shifting to ethics and clinical practice. There's a warning about playing two different roles.
Yes, the dual role dilemma. It's strongly recommended that a treating clinician should not also serve as a forensic evaluator for the same patient or family.
Why not?
Think about it. If you're someone's therapist, your primary loyalty is to them, building trust, maintaining confidentiality. If you're then asked to evaluate them for, say, a custody dispute, you might have to provide information that's harmful to their case.
It breaks the trust?
Completely. It creates an unavoidable conflict of interest and undermines the therapeutic relationship. The roles need to be kept separate.
Makes sense. And with minors, there's a distinction between the parent's role and the child's.
Right. We differentiate consent from assent. Consent is the legal permission required from parents or guardians for treatment or procedures involving a minor.
That's the legal part.
Yes. Assent is the child's own agreement to participate, based on their ability to understand what's involved. Getting assent, respecting the child's developing autonomy as much as possible, is a crucial part of ethical practice. It's not always legally required, but it's morally important.
Okay, finally, let's tackle the huge systemic issue of racism and inequity. The sources are quite direct about this.
Very direct. They explicitly cite the CDC and the American Academy of Pediatrics in recognizing racism as a serious public health threat, and importantly, as an adverse childhood experience in ACE.
So, on par with abuse or neglect in terms of potential harm.
In terms of its impact as a chronic stressor, yes. Structural racism creates these pervasive disparities. We see it in schools where Black and Native American youth are disproportionately disciplined.
And in the justice system.
Absolutely. Black youth are far more likely to be detained in juvenile justice facilities, 5 times more likely than white peers, the text notes, and they're more likely to be diagnosed with certain labels like emotional disturbance or intellectual disability in schools.
And this isn't just psychological stress. You mentioned neurobiology earlier. Does chronic systemic stress have biological effects too?
Emerging research strongly suggests it does. Early life stress, including the stress from racial and socioeconomic disadvantage, appears to be linked to accelerated maturation.
Accelerated maturation. What does that mean biologically?
Some studies show evidence like thinner cortical lining in the brains of young children experiencing this chronic stress. Their brain structure looks more like that of an older child.
So stress is literally aging their brains faster.
It seems to be accelerating certain aspects of development, potentially shortening crucial periods of developmental plasticity or flexibility. The implications are quite profound.
Wow. Okay, so wrapping this all up, we've covered a huge amount of foster care risks, the deep impact of trauma and illness, challenges with substance use, technology, sleep, and these massive systemic issues of education and equity.
The scope of vulnerability is immense, it's true, but the hopeful part is that solutions, or at least effective interventions, often are known. The path forward really emphasizes evidence-based prevention.
Can you give examples?
Sure. The text mentions things like the Coping with Depression course, for adolescents at risk. It shows lasting success in preventing depressive episodes. Or the Incredible Years Parenting series, which helps reduce early conduct problems by improving how parents and young children interact.
So intervening early, upstream.
Exactly. Mitigating risk factors before they snowball into chronic psychiatric conditions. That's the goal.
Which leaves us with a pretty challenging final thought, doesn't it? If we know that experiences like maltreatment, racism, chronic illness, these ACEs, if we know they're linked not just to psychological pain, but to actual changes in brain development, to this accelerated maturation, what responsibility do we have that as informed people, as a society? What's our role in advocating for the kinds of community changes, the resources, the systemic fixes that could actually alter those environments?
Yeah.
That could give kids a more equitable biological and psychological starting point even before they hit kindergarten.
That's the crucial question, isn't it? Moving beyond individual treatment to prevention and systemic change. It's a massive undertaking, but arguably the most important one.